Robert hadn't planned on buying a ranch at 45. Not once in his life had he imagined himself as a ranch owner. The computer guy had spent all his working years in busy cities, the last 10 in Seattle. Day after day, he'd grown tired of the tiny apartment, the never-ending noise, and the sky-high rent that kept climbing each year. His life was rows of code on screens and hurried coffee breaks between meetings. Then his Aunt Judy died. They hadn't been close. She was his mother's older sister who sent birthday cards with $10 bills well into his 30s. But apparently, she'd done well with some land investments, and to Robert's shock, she'd left him enough money to think about a big change. Maybe I could live somewhere with actual stars at night, he thought as he scrolled through property listings one Friday evening, a beer in hand. That's when he saw it. The 50-acre spread in eastern Washington jumped off the screen. The photos showed gently rolling hills covered in golden grass, a little creek cutting through one corner, and a simple but solid ranch house with a wide porch. Best of all, no neighbors in sight. The price tag made him do a double take. It was way below what similar properties were going for. There's got to be something wrong with it, he muttered, but called the real estate agent anyway. 3 weeks later, Robert stood on his new land, keys in hand, breathing air that smelled of pine and dry earth instead of exhaust and takeout. He walked the property line, stopping now and then to pick up interesting rocks or just look at the wide open sky. For the first time in years, his shoulders relaxed. I can build that workshop I've always wanted, he said to himself, already planning where it would go. Maybe get some chickens, learn to grow vegetables. The possibilities seemed endless. The real estate lady, Beth, had been super friendly, rushing him through the paperwork with lots of talk about what a steal the place was. Previous owners had to relocate suddenly for work, she'd explained with a bright smile when Robert asked about the low price. Their loss is your gain. What Beth hadn't mentioned, and what Robert had missed in the tiny print on page 17 of the contract, was the recently formed homeowners association that technically covered his property and 11 others along the rural road. 5 days after moving in, Robert found a thick envelope stuck in his new mailbox. Inside was a book. No, other word for it, of HOA rules. 73 pages of them. As he flipped through restrictions about how tall his grass could be, not above 3.5 inches, what colors he could paint his house, earth tones only, from an approved palette, where he could plant trees, nowhere without written permission, and how many cars he could have visible, too. Robert felt his stomach tighten. This can't be right, he said, looking around at his supposedly free and open land. The next page detailed mandatory monthly meetings, yearly dues that seemed way too high, and the HOA's right to enter his property for compliance inspections, with just 24 hours notice. The previous owners hadn't said a word about any HOA. Beth had conveniently forgotten to mention it, and now Robert was legally bound to all these rules he'd never agreed to. He tossed the rule book on his kitchen table and stared out the window at his dream property, now feeling more like a fancy prison. But as the sun set over his land, painting the hills in warm orange light, Robert's mind, the same mind that solved complex coding problems for a living, began to work in a different way. Every system has weaknesses, he thought, pulling out a notebook. Even this one. Robert had just made his morning coffee when someone pounded on his front door like they were trying to break it down. It was barely 7:30 a.m. on a Tuesday. He opened the door to find a short woman with gray hair pulled back so tight it looked painful. She wore a beige pantsuit and carried a clipboard like it was a weapon. Her thin lips were pressed together in a line that hadn't smiled in years. "Mr. Harlow?" she asked, without waiting for an answer. "I'm Nancy Wilson, president of the Pinewood Estates Homeowners Association." Behind her stood two people, a balding man with a camera and a younger woman who kept glancing at Robert's yard and writing things down. "We've noticed several violations on your property," Nancy said, her voice sharp as broken glass. "Your temporary gate isn't on the approved design list, and that," she pointed at Robert's pride and joy, his old blue Ford pickup, "is classified as a commercial vehicle which must be stored out of sight." Robert blinked, still holding his coffee mug. The pickup had taken him 4 years to restore, working weekends in his tiny apartment garage. The gate was just some posts and wire he'd put up to keep deer out while he figured out something nicer. "Good morning to you too," he said calmly. "Sorry, I didn't realize the truck was an issue. I've been driving it since college." Nancy's eyebrows shot up like his politeness was somehow suspicious. Section 12, paragraph 7 clearly states all non-passenger vehicles must be stored in approved structures, not in driveways. She flipped through papers on her clipboard. "You're looking at a $150 fine for the gate and $75 per day for the truck until these violations are corrected." The balding man snapped photos while the younger woman nodded like this was all completely normal. "I see," Robert said, taking a sip of his coffee. "Can I see where it says that about the truck? I read through the rules but must have missed that part." Something flickered across Nancy's face. Surprise maybe, or irritation that he wasn't yelling. Most people probably yelled. For the next 15 minutes, Robert stood on his porch asking calm, reasonable questions. Where exactly did it say his particular truck was commercial? Could she show him the approved gate designs? What was the process for requesting exceptions? Each question seemed to frustrate Nancy more than the last. People who got mad were easy to deal with. People who asked for clarification and took notes were dangerous. "We'll send you formal notice of the violations," she finally snapped, turning to leave. "You have 7 days to comply before daily fines begin." After they drove away in matching white SUVs, Robert sat at his kitchen table and opened his laptop. He created a new folder called HOA and started a spreadsheet. In the first column, he listed every rule from the book, all 73 pages worth. In the second column, he wrote what he'd seen of how they enforced each rule. "So that's how it's going to be," he murmured, thinking about Nancy's smug face when she'd mentioned fines. He looked out the window at his truck. His dad had taught him to drive in that truck. They'd rebuilt the engine together the summer before Dad died. No way was he hiding it in a garage like something shameful. As he typed, Robert remembered something his old boss used to say. The people who write the rules often don't understand the systems they're trying to control. As a computer guy, Robert knew all about systems, how they worked, where they broke, and most importantly, how to work within their limitations to get what you wanted. He left the third column of his spreadsheet empty for now. That would come later, after he understood exactly what kind of people he was dealing with. Robert took another sip of his now cold coffee and smiled slightly. If there was one thing he was good at, it was solving puzzles. And Nancy Wilson had just handed him a big one. The letters started coming every week, sometimes twice a week. Robert's mailbox flag was always up, and inside would be another official notice with the Pinewood Estates HOA logo at the top. Each one listed a new violation with a fine attached. "Your mailbox is 2 inches too high," one notice claimed. "Unauthorized garden plants visible from the road," said another. "Improper placement of trash cans," a third one stated. Robert took pictures of everything. His mailbox matched the exact height of all his neighbors. His garden had only plants from the approved list. His trash cans were behind the little fence exactly where they were supposed to be, but the fines kept coming. $75 here, $150 there. Soon they added up to over $1,000. One evening, while watering his struggling tomato plants, which he'd moved to the backyard just to avoid trouble, Robert noticed his neighbor Tom walking by. Tom was an older guy who kept to himself, but he waved and came over. "Getting the Nancy treatment, huh?" Tom asked, looking at the stack of violation notices on Robert's porch table. "You could say that," Robert replied. "Does she do this to everyone?" Tom laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "Just the ones she wants gone. 3 families have owned your place in the last 5 years. None lasted more than 8 months. "Why would she want me gone?" Robert asked. "She doesn't even know me." "Your land has the best view in the area. Nancy's son-in-law is a developer. Connect the dots." Tom glanced over his shoulder before adding, "Look up who bought those other places after the owners left. Always the same company. Always at way below market price." Robert thanked Tom for the tip. That night, he did some digging online. Sure enough, the last 3 owners of his ranch had sold to the same LLC. Public record showed the company was registered to someone named Brian Wilson, who happened to be married to Nancy's daughter, according to their public Facebook profiles. So that's the game, Robert muttered. He started going to every HOA meeting, sitting quietly in the back with his notebook. He watched how Nancy ran the meetings like a little dictator, how the same 5 people always voted together on everything, how other homeowners looked afraid to speak up. During one meeting, Robert noticed something important while Nancy complained about road maintenance costs. She mentioned the gate system at the entrance to their community road, how expensive it was to maintain, but how crucial it was for controlling access. The way she said those words made Robert pay attention. Control. That's what this was all about. The next day, Robert drove around the whole area, noting how the roads connected. Their community had only one way in and out, through the main gate, where everyone needed a special key fob to enter. If your fob was deactivated, you couldn't get home. Over his morning coffee, Robert added another column to his spreadsheet: gate access issues. He found 14 cases on community message boards where homeowners had mysteriously lost gate access right after disagreeing with Nancy at meetings. Robert had been taking pictures of everything, saving every letter, and recording every conversation. Perfectly legal in Washington state, which only required one person to know about the recording. He kept everything organized in folders labeled by date. He also noticed how Nancy and her friends used their power. They weren't just random jerks, they had a system. They targeted one homeowner at a time, overwhelmed them with fines and harassment, and then swooped in to buy their property cheap when the owner gave up. As fall turned to winter, Robert kept pretending to be bothered but not broken by their tactics. He'd fix one violation while questioning another. He'd pay some fines while formally disputing others. He never lost his temper, which clearly frustrated Nancy. What Nancy didn't know was that Robert had started making friends with county officials, going to town meetings, and quietly learning all the laws about HOAs and property rights. He was building his own system, one that would be ready when he needed it. Most importantly, Robert realized the HOA's power had one big weakness. It depended entirely on controlling that front gate. Robert spread the old property maps across his kitchen table. He'd found them tucked away in the county records office after spending 3 dusty hours searching through files most people never bothered with. There has to be another way in, he muttered, tracing his finger along the boundary lines. Then, he saw it. A thin line marking a 15-foot wide strip running from the back corner of his property to a rarely used county fire road. The notes called it an access easement, legal speak for a right to use someone else's land to reach your own. Robert grabbed his boots and jacket despite the cold December air. He needed to see this with his own eyes. After a 20-minute hike through his back field, Robert found himself staring at an overgrown path blocked by years of fallen trees and thick brush. But it was there, his second way in and out that didn't require Nancy's precious gate. Perfect, he whispered, already, planning in his head. The next day he called Mike, a local contractor who'd helped fix his roof last month. "I've got a drainage problem in my back field," Robert explained when Mike arrived. "Need to put in some culverts before spring rain makes it worse." This wasn't a lie. He did have drainage issues, but it wasn't the whole truth either. Over the next few weekends, Mike's small crew cleared the old easement path, careful to make it look like they were just fixing water flow problems. They installed large drainage pipes that could easily support the weight of a truck. They spread gravel in a way that created a perfectly drivable path, but one that didn't look like a road to anyone flying Nancy's inspection drone over the property. "You expecting a flood?" Mike joked one day as they finished another section. Robert just smiled. Always good to be prepared. While the work in the backfield continued, Robert started attending township meetings every Tuesday night. He chatted with county commissioners, brought donuts to the planning office, and made friends with Bill, the fire marshal, by helping fix his computer for free. "So if someone blocked access to a property," Robert asked Bill one day over coffee, "what would the fire code have to say about that?" Bill looked interested. "Blocking emergency access is a serious violation. We require all properties to have workable access routes for emergency vehicles. Why do you ask? Robert shrugged. Just curious about the rules. Our HOA is very focused on their fancy gate system. Those private community gates can be problematic, Bill said, frowning. They need to have emergency overrides or they're not up to code. Robert filed this information away carefully. Back at home, Robert was busy with other preparations. He installed a backup generator system, disguised as a garden shed. He set up a large water storage tank, hidden within a decorative windmill, structure that Nancy actually complimented during one of her inspections. He even added a satellite internet dish that looked like a regular TV antenna. Each addition to his property followed a careful strategy. Be completely legal according to the HOA rules, serve a useful backup purpose, and help make his ranch independent. From community systems, Robert also started working on his computer at night, using his tech skills to study the HOA's gate system through public records requests. The system had been installed cheaply by Nancy's brother's company 5 years ago. The more Robert looked, the more security flaws he found. Outdated software, predictable access codes, and no proper emergency protocols. He documented everything, but did nothing with the information. Not yet. The whole time, Robert maintained his role as the HOA's difficult but ultimately harmless target. He'd argue about small violations while fixing others. He'd show up at meetings to question the budget, but never push too hard. He wanted Nancy to think she was winning, and it was working. At the last meeting, he'd overheard Nancy telling her friend, "He'll break eventually. They always do." Robert smiled to himself as he finished connecting the backup power to his well pump. Nancy had no idea that while she was busy trying to break him, he'd been quietly building a fortress and planning for the day she would finally go too far. Robert woke up early that January morning. The thermometer outside his kitchen window showed 12 degrees, cold enough to see his breath inside the house. He had to leave by 8:30 for his doctor's appointment in town. Nothing serious, just his yearly checkup, but Dr. Chen was always booked solid and rescheduling would mean waiting another 3 months. After a quick shower and coffee, Robert headed out to warm up his truck. He pressed the gate remote as he approached the end of his driveway. Nothing happened. He pressed it again, holding it longer this time. Still nothing. "You gotta be kidding me," he muttered, getting out of the truck. He tried the keypad on the gate post, punching in his code. The little screen flashed red. Access denied. Robert checked his phone. No service, which wasn't unusual during bad weather. He walked back to the house and called the property management company from his landline. "Pinewood Estates, this is Debbie," a bored voice answered. "Hi, Debbie. This is Robert Harlow at 156 Ridge Road. My gate access isn't working. One moment, please." The line went silent for nearly a minute. "I see a note here that your access has been temporarily suspended due to unpaid violation fines." "What? Unpaid fines?" "I paid everything that wasn't under dispute," Robert said, keeping his voice calm. "The system shows you owe $2,750 in accumulated fines and late fees," Debbie replied. "You'll need to speak with the HOA board about reinstatement. I have a doctor's appointment in an hour. How do I get out?" "I'm sorry, but I can't override. A board suspension. You'll need to contact the board president." Robert thanked her and immediately called Nancy's number. It rang 6 times before she picked up. "Yes, Mr. Harlow?" Her voice had that smug tone he'd come to recognize, the sound of someone enjoying their little bit of power too much. "My gate access isn't working, and I have a doctor's appointment." "Oh dear," Nancy said, not sounding concerned at all. "The board voted last night to suspend access privileges for homeowners with excessive unpaid fines. You've accumulated quite a list." Robert looked at the stack of violation notices on his counter. "Half of these are bogus and you know it. My holiday lights were the exact same as the Johnsons across the street, but only I got fined." "The Johnsons submitted proper approval forms," Nancy said. "As for your other violations, storing firewood in a visible location, improper snow removal, and unapproved exterior lighting, those are clearly outlined in the bylaws." "I need to get to my doctor," Robert said, glancing at his watch. "Can you temporarily restore my access?" I'm afraid not. The board doesn't meet again for 2 weeks. You can appeal then, or pay the full amount to have your access reinstated immediately. Nancy, blocking medical access could be a safety issue, Robert said carefully. Her laugh was short and cold. Perhaps you should have thought about that. Before repeatedly violating our community standards, the rules apply to everyone, Mr. Harlow, even you. She hung up before he could respond. Robert stood in his kitchen staring at the phone. This was it, the moment he'd been preparing for. Nancy had finally gone too far, thinking she had him trapped. She believed he had no choice but to pay or miss important appointments until he eventually gave up and sold his ranch at a loss. What she didn't know was that Robert had been expecting this exact scenario. He smiled slightly as he put the phone down and walked to his closet. He grabbed his warmest jacket and boots. Then he picked up a small notebook where he'd written down the names and direct phone numbers of key county officials. As he headed toward his truck, Robert paused to look back at his house. For months, Nancy had been playing a game where she made all the rules. But Robert had been playing a different game altogether, one where he'd carefully set up the board, positioned all the pieces, and been waiting patiently for her to make exactly this move. "Checkmate, Nancy," he whispered as he climbed into his truck and headed toward the back of his property, where a clear path, hidden from view but completely drivable, waited to take him exactly where he needed to go. Robert's truck bounced along the rough path through the back of his property. He'd only driven this way twice before, testing it after Mike and his crew finished the work. The frozen ground actually made it easier to navigate now. After about 10 minutes of careful driving, he reached the old county fire road. From there, it was a 15-minute drive to town, a bit longer than his usual route, but he'd still make his doctor's appointment with time to spare. As Dr. Chen checked his blood pressure, Robert pulled out his phone. "Do you mind if I make a few calls after we're done? It's been an interesting morning." "Your blood pressure's a little high today," Dr. Chen noted. "Something stressful happening?" Robert laughed. "You could say that. My HOA locked me out of my own property today." "They can do that?" Dr. Chen looked shocked. "They think they can," Robert replied. "But they're about to learn otherwise." After his appointment, Robert sat in his truck and made his first call, to Frank Taylor, the property rights attorney he'd met at the township meetings. Robert explained what had happened that morning. "So they've actually done it," Frank said, sounding almost excited. "This is exactly what we've been waiting for. Give me an hour to file for an emergency injunction." "Where are you now?" "In town. I used my backup access route." "Perfect. Their faces when they realize you got out anyway." Frank laughed. "I'll call you when the paperwork's filed." Robert's next call was to Bill, the fire marshal. "They did what?" Bill's voice rose in disbelief. "Deactivated your access without providing an alternative. That's a clear violation of County Fire Code 23.7. I'll be out there within the hour." "Thanks, Bill. I've got all the documentation ready for you." Robert's third call was to Pat Chen at the local newspaper, no relation, to his doctor. "Remember that tip I mentioned about possible HOA fund mismanagement? I've got the full story now with documentation." By noon, Robert was back at his ranch, having used his hidden entrance again. He sat at his kitchen table with his laptop open, typing up a detailed report about the HOA gate system's security flaws. He'd discovered that the system had no emergency override for fire or medical personnel, a serious safety violation. He had just finished when his phone rang. It was Frank. "Good news. Judge Wilson granted our emergency injunction. The HOA cannot restrict your access in any way pending a full hearing next week. I'm emailing you the documents now." "Perfect timing," Robert said. The fire marshal just pulled up. For the next hour, Robert walked Bill through everything: the gate system, the access restrictions, the pattern of selective enforcement. Bill took detailed notes, shaking his head more with each new revelation. "This is serious," Bill said finally. "I'm issuing an immediate safety violation notice. They'll have 48 hours to install proper emergency access protocols, or the county will require the gate to remain open until they comply." Robert nodded. "There's one more thing you should see." He opened his laptop and showed Bill his report on the gate system's security vulnerabilities. If someone wanted to, they could override the entire system with a simple device. In an emergency, that could cost lives. Bill's face darkened. This goes beyond HOA issues into public safety territory. As Bill was leaving, 3 more vehicles pulled up: a county commissioner, a reporter from the local news station, and Tom, Robert's neighbor, with 4 other homeowners. "We heard what happened," Tom said. "We're done being scared of Nancy. We brought our stories and evidence too." Robert invited everyone inside. As they gathered around his kitchen table sharing documents and experiences, his phone kept ringing with calls from other neighbors and even the property management company, suddenly very concerned about resolving this unfortunate misunderstanding. By evening, Nancy was facing multiple investigations, from the fire marshal for safety violations, from the county for permit issues with the gate, from the state attorney general's office for HOA fund mismanagement, and from angry homeowners who'd finally found the courage to stand up. As Robert watched the community rally together, he thought about systems, how they could be used to control people, but also how they could fail when pushed too far. Nancy had built a system of fear and control, never imagining that someone would methodically find its weaknesses. She'd locked him out, thinking he was trapped. Instead, she'd locked herself in. The library meeting room was packed. People stood along the walls, some even peering in through the doorway. Robert had never seen so many of his neighbors in one place. Nancy sat at the front table with the remaining board members. 2 seats were empty. The treasurer had resigned yesterday, and another board member claimed a sudden family emergency after the fire marshal's report went public. Nancy's usually perfect hair looked hastily styled, and she kept straightening papers that didn't need straightening. The confident smirk was gone, replaced by a tight, nervous smile that didn't reach her eyes. Sheriff Cooper stood by the door. Not in an official capacity, he'd said, but just to make sure everyone stays civil. Everyone knew the real reason. The investigation into the HOA finances had taken a serious turn. Bill, the fire marshal, spoke first, his deep voice filling the room. "The county inspection found multiple violations in your gate access system," he said, looking directly at Nancy. "No emergency override for first responders, no backup power system, and most concerning, a pattern of selectively restricting homeowner access, which creates a serious safety risk." He held up a document. "This is an official order requiring immediate changes to comply with county fire code. Until those changes are implemented, the gate must remain open at all times." Nancy tried to interrupt, but Bill continued. "Additionally, we've found no record of proper permits for the original gate installation." Robert watched from the back row as County Commissioner Linda Ward took the microphone next. Her gray ponytail swung as she addressed the crowd. "The county has reviewed the community road maintenance agreement," she explained. "The current HOA board has been operating outside its legal authority in several areas, most notably in restricting property access without due process." Robert's attorney, Frank, was next, presenting the proposed bylaw changes they'd drafted. The new rules would limit the HOA's power to issuing fines only after a hearing process, require multiple quotes for all community projects, and mandate transparent financial reporting. These changes would bring your HOA into compliance with state law, Frank explained. They would also prevent the kind of selective enforcement and intimidation tactics that multiple homeowners have documented. When the vote came, the result was overwhelming: 42 in favor, 5 against. Nancy's little empire was crumbling before her eyes. As people began discussing nominations for a new board, Robert slipped outside for some fresh air. He stood looking at the stars, finally visible now that the fancy and unnecessary HOA-mandated streetlights had been dimmed to comply with county light pollution ordinances. He felt someone approach and turned to see Nancy. For a moment they stood in silence. "You planned this all along, didn't you?" she finally asked, her voice smaller than he'd ever heard it. Robert considered the question. "No," he answered honestly. "I just wanted a quiet place to live. But when you decided I didn't belong here, I had to make a choice, leave or stand my ground." You could have just followed the rules like everyone else, Nancy said, but there was no conviction in her voice. Rules should protect people, not control them, Robert replied. That was something your board never understood. Nancy stared at him for a long moment. My son-in-law's development deal fell through yesterday. He had buyers lined up for luxury condos where your ranch sits. It was as close to an admission as he would ever get. Sorry about that, Robert said, though he wasn't. In the following weeks, life at Pinewood Estates changed dramatically. The new board, led by Tom and other longtime residents, focused on actual community needs, fixing the roads, updating the aging water system, and creating a fair process for handling violations. The gate was redesigned with proper safety features and emergency access. Robert's back entrance was officially recognized and developed into a secondary emergency route for the entire community. As spring arrived, Robert built the workshop he'd been planning since he bought the place. No one complained about the color or demanded special permits. One sunny morning, he sat on his porch drinking coffee, watching birds return to his newly planted garden. His neighbors' kids rode bikes on the road, their laughter carrying on the breeze. For the first time since moving in, the ranch felt like what it was always meant to be, not a battleground, but a home. Robert smiled as he thought about systems, how the HOA's system of control had been replaced by a system of community. The irony wasn't lost on him that in trying to force him out, Nancy had actually helped create a neighborhood where he truly wanted to stay.